Thanks, Paul, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to the Petrocelli Center for having me. So just quick show of hands, how many of you have heard of Lean Startup already? One, two, a couple people. Has anybody read Eric Ries's book? Okay, cool, good. And I gauged the audience right. So let's start off with how Eric describes Lean Startup. Eric is the person who coined the term Lean Startup by applying Lean methodologies to startup organizations. Eric talks about a startup as being a human institution designed to deliver a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. You'll notice that this says nothing about profit or anything of that nature, so that a lot of the principles apply both to for-profit companies and to nonprofits, or to social enterprises, anything in between. When we talk about startups, we usually talk about three major types of risk: market risk, tech risk, and ego risk. Market risk is the will anybody buy this, will anybody engage with our organization. Tech risk is, can we actually build what we're promising? Can we create the thing that we're trying to build? And ego risk is, can I, as the entrepreneur, get out of my own way, overcome my cognitive biases, and pay attention to what the data is telling me and not get emotionally involved in what I think is the right solution. Lean Startup primarily deals with ameliorating the market risk. And one of the ways that it does that is by sort of turning on its head the typical notion of startup organizations where we acknowledge that the build it and they will come is a myth, and perhaps a dream, a pipe dream. And so a lot of Lean Startup focuses on validating that you can in fact reach the market that you're trying to serve, whether it's customers or constituents in a nonprofit setting, and that they are actually interested in what you have to offer and taking advantage of it. Before I go to that next one, I have a story to tell. Okay, so one of the organizations that I work with is called Lean Startup Machine. They run intensive weekend workshops. And the founder of Lean Startup Machine, Trevor, is fond of telling a story where his first introduction to Lean was through making some mistakes in a business venture. He saw a trend in people riding scooters around campus. He went to school in New York. And saw people riding scooters around and thought there was an opportunity here, and saw maybe these people who are riding scooters, that are riding these gas-powered scooters, might be interested in riding electric scooters instead because it's cheaper, it's better for the environment, it's it seems like a great deal all around. So he went and bought a shipment of scooters from China and spent months trying to sell them. And he was trying to sell them all over campus. He parked them in front of the campus center, in front of the gym, and with a sign on them, and couldn't get anybody to bite. And eventually he started talking to people about why they wanted, or why they were riding scooters. He at one point posted a listing on Craigslist saying, hey, I've got a Vespa for sale. And when people called up, he'd say, oh, well, I already sold that, but I've got these great electric scooters that are even better. Don't you want one of these? And the realization for him, the turning point, was when one of the people who he talked to said, no, man, I don't want an electric scooter. I just want to ride a Vespa and wear a skinny tie. And he realized that the scooter was not really about being energy efficient. It wasn't about not using a lot of gas. It wasn't about getting from point to point. It was an identity statement. It was people wanted to identify with the brand and with the lifestyle. And so he realized that this deal was not going to go. And I think of that entire shipment, he eventually sold one scooter, but that was it. The rest of them he had to liquidate. So that's sort of an introduction to why it might be important to understand what your market wants before making an investment in trying to sell to it. In a nonprofit space, we can apply this also by starting with the problem instead of a solution. If we look at this kid, what do we think he needs? Anybody want? Smaller bike?
He just needs a curb.
All right, yeah, that's good, creative thinking. Yeah, a smaller bike might be useful, but what if we talked to him and said, well, what do you use the bike for? And it turns out that actually the bike is not to get him from point to point. The bike is so that he can go from the farm where his parents grow crops into the various markets around the nearby markets and find out what the prices are that those crops are selling for, so that they can bring their crops to the correct market to get the best deal for selling their produce. So actually, a solution for this problem might not be a smaller bike, it might be a cell phone, right? Until we actually understand what the problem is we're trying to solve, we don't necessarily know what the best way is to go about solving it. And the best way to figure out what the real problem is, how to understand the problem, is to talk to the customers or the people that you're trying to help. I'm going to let this sink in for a minute. Oftentimes I hear people talking about how they want to start a nonprofit, and they think that that's going to make it easier than starting a for-profit company because, well, you know, I don't need to have revenue, I don't need to make the books balance or whatever. That's not true. Normally, when you start a for-profit company, you've discovered, once you've achieved product market fit, you've discovered both the method of delivering value and the person who's going to pay for it, right? Usually the person your customer is going to give you money, and that's how you sustain the organization. In nonprofits, you are both trying to discover how to deliver value to a particular constituency and get them to accept that value, and then also going to another party and asking them to subsidize it or to fund your delivery of services. So it's actually, there's twice as many variables to balance in a nonprofit. So if you're thinking about starting an organization, it's worth recognizing that it's much, much harder to start a sustainable nonprofit than to start a sustainable for-profit company. Who knows what this is? Anybody? Yes, who said that? Yes, it's a mosquito net. This is, Permanet is made by Vestergaard France, and they're one of the biggest producers of mosquito nets in the world. Mosquito nets are wonderful for communities, they're wonderful for preventing malaria, they're treated with insecticides, they kill the mosquitoes that land, and when you get certain coverage in a community, you actually start to see network effects so that even the people who don't have mosquito nets over their beds get malaria less often because the mosquitoes that are going to try to bite people are getting killed by the insecticide. So mosquito nets are wonderful for communities in preventing malaria, but that doesn't necessarily mean that just giving out mosquito nets is enough to get people to use them. Can anybody think of what kind of objections people might have to using a mosquito net, or why they might not use one even if they're given one to put up?
They're kind of uncomfortable, I guess.
Yeah, that's definitely a big part of it. It's hot and it's stifling, and when you're under that mosquito net and you don't have any airflow, it's not comfortable. Yeah. Anything else?
The insecticide on there probably smells funny.
Yeah, it doesn't so much smell, but if you touch it with your skin, you get a rash. Yeah. Yeah. Others?
It looks really girly.
So the appearance of it is actually an issue. But the issue initially, so the first mosquito nets, or the first sort of wave of mosquito nets that they tried to distribute were all white, because they thought, you know, white's a very easy neutral color. And they discovered after talking to people about why they weren't putting them up, there are two problems with a white mosquito net. One is it gets dirty, and it shows dirt, and people don't want to have that in their house. And if they're getting a mosquito net that's supposed to last them 3 years, it's hard to keep that clean. And if they try to clean it, if they try to wash it with soap or something, they may end up taking the insecticide out and losing a lot of the benefit. The other thing is that in many cultures, a white shroud over the bed is a symbol of death. That's kind of important to know when you're designing a product or trying to deliver services like this to a community that's not your own, right? Understanding that, well, they don't want to put a white death shroud over it because that's kind of a downer, right? And there's actually a lot of other challenges that you discover when you start going into the field to try to put up mosquito nets, which, you know, some of them are designed to be hung from four corners, and if you are hanging them in an urban setting, a lot of the people who are living there are not necessarily living in buildings that have drywall put in already. It may just be a concrete slab, and so they don't have anywhere to hang it, right? Unless you have, you know, concrete screws or something, right? They have to rig up a way to hang it. And then on top of that, even if you're going around during the day trying to hang them up, most people don't have electricity or lights in their homes. At least not most. I should specify. I did work in West Africa, in Ghana. And in the areas of Ghana that I was in, which is not necessarily representative of all of Africa, obviously, but just a little caveat there. In areas that I was in, most people did not have electricity, did not have light inside the home, so you needed a flashlight even during the day to see what you were doing well enough to hang up the mosquito net. So these are all examples of why, even though we have something that is delivering value, there are any number of reasons why the constituents might not accept that. And so it's important to talk to the people that you're trying to help. And the whole process of doing this in Lean Startup we call customer development. And customer, of course, because it starts in the for-profit space, but it can equally be constituent development. And this is why it's important to talk to the people you're trying to help, as well as maybe experts or whatever in the field, but particularly understanding what the problem is and how the people that you're trying to help view the problem can be eye-opening. a lot of ways. So lean startup actually is one of a number of approaches from different backgrounds trying to get at this same problem where in the design space, the design thinking movement is a lot of similarity. In sociology, the ethnography practice is very similar. In the nonprofit space, evidence-based policy bears a lot of similarity. And of course, the scientific method, right? The approach of forming a hypothesis and then collecting data to test that hypothesis. So these are all very similar approaches to getting at this same sort of problem in the middle from different backgrounds, from different contexts. So talking about what lean startup really is, the idea is that we're trying to get at efficiency, right? Lean is all about being efficient. And so the key to lean is that efficiency we define as value produced over resources used, right? This doesn't necessarily mean cheap, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that we can't spend money. In some cases, the most effective method is a more expensive method, and that's important to recognize. But overall, this is the goal that we're trying to maximize efficiency by maximizing the value that's produced over the resources used. And in particular, one of the best ways to make sure that you're getting great results for the amount of effort you're putting in is to learn along the way, right? As we improve our processes, Lean initially sort of started in manufacturing, where the goal was to produce the maximum number of high-quality physical goods with a minimum amount of waste. So minimizing things like rework and defects and things like that. Six Sigma is a similar thing that was sort of that. Anyway. In the startup space, it often tends to be a lot more about figuring out how to create the sustainable business and learning about your customers and about the product and about the problem in a way that takes the fewest resources. So instead of perhaps building a huge organization to solve some problem and then realizing that it doesn't actually solve the problem that you're trying to solve, or that the solution is not one that's going to work, testing it in small little steps along the way so you get many opportunities to course correct instead of betting everything on one big solution. Has anybody heard of Brownian motion? Anyone in biology or yeah? Can you describe it maybe?
Isn't that where you have a whole bunch of particles in the air and they're moving kind of haphazardly because they're high energy and stuff? Yeah,
that's right. So it's named for Robert Brown, which is why it's Brownian motion. And initially, he was looking at pollen grains through a microscope, and he saw these pollen grains moving seemingly at random and couldn't decipher why they were doing so. He thought he'd actually discovered sort of the element of life. It was later proven wrong, but the thing that was causing these pollen grains to move was the random impacts of all of the other molecules in the water. And at some points there would be more random impacts on one side and some on the other, and so they would look like they were moving randomly. But the external forces acting on the pollen molecules were much greater than any force that the pollen molecules were exerting on their environment. And this is also true of startup organizations. The random factors and the external forces acting on your organization are going to be much greater than any influence your organization can exert on your surroundings. So what does that mean for creating an organization that lasts? Well, part of it is you just have to survive long enough to get lucky, right? You have to keep trying things until you hit on the one that does work. And the less resources you spend on each iteration of the process, the more chances you're going to get it right. In other words, get more at-bats, right? The more times you get to run a test to figure out whether you found something that actually works, the more likely you are to ultimately succeed. And in some cases, it's going to be a matter of being in the right place at the right time. In other cases, you may have 10 possible routes to take, and if you commit all of your resources to one of those, there's a 90% chance you're wrong. But if you test each one of them, there's a much better chance that you're going to discover which one is most likely to succeed. And then, so talking about the similarities between for-profit companies and non-profit organizations. A lot of you who are thinking about starting organizations are probably thinking about where you can get the resources to start that, unless you're bootstrapping. If you are, awesome. But if you're looking to raise money for a social venture or to raise funding for a nonprofit organization, the approach is pretty much the same. Investors are roughly congruent to funders for nonprofits. when you are trying to raise money for a for-profit or a social venture, showing some measure of traction, showing that you actually have something that's working, makes it infinitely easier to raise money. And the same is true for raising money for nonprofits. If you can prove that the money that you're spending is actually having an impact, that you're making a difference, it's much easier to get people to give you more money to keep doing it. So this is another argument for testing in small batches and then scaling after you've found out what works. So there's a couple of common myths about the lean startup process that I run into in the media all the time. Since most of you have not come across these, I'm just going to inoculate you now. Lean does not mean cheap. I touched on this earlier, but in some cases, the best thing that you can, the most efficient thing you can do is to spend more money to get a solution faster. Often, what entrepreneurs forget when they're starting an organization is that your own time is a resource. And so if you can spend a little bit of money to save yourself 6 months of work, it's probably going to be a good trade-off. Just keep that in mind. The second myth that we hear a lot is that lean startup only works for tech companies. Totally not true. And in fact, every time somebody says, well, lean startup only works for X, Y, or Z, or it works for everything except, there's some example, somebody comes forward and says, well, I'm actually using it in that context and it works great. It really is just, it's the scientific method applied to business for nonprofits. And so it works for all kinds of organizations. It started in tech companies. There's a lot more analytics and data and A/B testing and conversion funnels and all kinds of wonderful things like that that you can do in tech companies. But there's ways to get a lot of value out of it in non-tech companies as well. The third myth that we hear is that lean replaces vision with data and A/B testing. The complaint is people say, well, if I'm just running experiments all the time, then my vision doesn't matter anymore. I'm just going where the data takes me. Right? The primary driving force behind any startup venture is the passion of the entrepreneur. And so if you run tests and find out that, in fact, the thing that you're trying to do can't be done in that way, and your data is pushing you in a different direction, you can either follow that, or if you're not passionate about that direction, the best thing you can do is quit and move on to something else. Because if you don't have a passion for it, it's going to be a slog, and it's not worth pushing through. Even you may not be the right person to implement that idea, and that's okay. That's perfectly reasonable. There are other things to move on to. So vision is very important, and lean is really just about making sure that we're not drinking our own Kool-Aid about that vision. Right? Okay. Any questions so far? Helmuth von Moltke the Elder said, "No plan survives first contact with the enemy." Or if you prefer, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Mike Tyson. All types of business planning. The process of planning a business is great, but the business plan itself, as a static document, is not particularly useful. If you have not actually come in contact with customers or your constituents, all of the wonderful plans in the world and all of the wonderful projections will fall apart the second you actually sit down and talk to somebody and figure out what it is that they want and what they need and what they expect from you. This is how we solve that problem. We get out of the building. Getting out of the building is a common phrase in Lean Startup. It refers to getting out of your own echo chamber and getting away from just talking to your team and going out and talking with your customers, your constituents, and understanding the way that they see the problem, the way that they talk about it, and the language that they use, instead of what you have inside your head. And the sooner you do this in your process, the better off you'll be, because the less time you potentially waste on planning for something that is based on false assumptions. Another thing that gets thrown around a lot is the idea of minimum viable product, or MVP. An MVP is simply an experiment. It is the way that you can spend the least amount of effort to get one turn through the build, measure, learn loop. So if you have an assumption about the way that your organization is going to work, take that one big assumption, the one that you may not have even labeled as an assumption yet, but if it turns out to be false, everything else falls apart. And if you test that assumption before you build out the rest of the organization, you're going to save yourself tons of time. In the case that you were actually right about that assumption, great. Now you have even more certainty going into working out, building the rest of the organization, testing the next assumption down. But the idea of a minimum viable product is, what can I do to collect real data that will validate or invalidate my core assumption, my riskiest assumption about the way that my business or the way that my nonprofit is going to work. So there's 3 typical types of MVPs that we work through, and I'll go through them in order here. The first one is problem exploration. And this is often done through interviews or other high bandwidth communication. So I'm talking about sitting down and talking with someone in person so that you can see their reaction when you ask them questions and they say, oh man, that's such a huge problem, or yeah, that's a pretty big problem. And reading between the lines and being able to see that is something you don't get if you do a survey or you're sending emails. The goal of problem exploration is to understand the problem in the terms that your constituents or customers think about it and talk about it. And the way you know that you've finished problem exploration is that every time you sit down with a new potential, you do them one-on-one. Focus groups are bad. Focus groups lead to groupthink, and that messes up all your results. The way you know you're finished with problem exploration is because you can sit down with somebody and after asking a couple of qualifying questions to figure out what segment they fall into, you can predict their answers to the rest of the questions you're going to ask them because you know already what everybody else who's in that demographic or that psychographic, the way that they're answering the questions. So this is the stage that a lot of people tend to jump past, and it's really important to actually spend time on this early on and make sure that you're not building castles on these assumptions that you haven't tested. Once we finish the problem exploration, the next typical type of MVP is a product pitch. Actually, let's go back to problem exploration for a minute. I'll give you a little bit of information on how to actually do this, right? That'd be useful, maybe. See some nodding heads? Okay. So it starts off, well, who do I talk to, right? And the key people to start with are the people that you know in your network, the people who are friends and family and colleagues who will take a meeting with you, right? And you can talk with them, and the questions that you ask are things like, this is a problem I'm interested in understanding. Can you tell me, do you have this problem? Can you tell me about a specific time you faced this problem? And then also, what are you currently doing now to try and solve this problem? And if they're not doing anything to try to solve the problem, you haven't really found a problem yet, right? Everybody who has a really big problem has some way that they're trying to solve it, and it may be something that they've hacked together, it may be something that they're paying a lot of money for, it may be something that doesn't quite solve their needs, but it gets closer. But if they're not looking for a solution, they're not going to be in your early adopter set, right? At this point, we're really just looking for the early adopters. It's the first people who are going to use your product or use your service because they're actively looking for this solution now. Later on, you can worry about scaling to the mass market, but if you can't find who's going to be the early adopters, you're not going to get enough traction yet to worry about that. And then the last question that's great to throw out in these kind of interviews, actually, 2 more questions. The last question about the problem is, if you had a magic wand you could wave and have any kind of solution to this problem, what would it look like? Because that's not really a leading question. It's a great way to get people to think outside the box, to think, man, if I could have any solution, what would I want? And they often will tell you the craziest things. And you may just actually have a way to give that to them. Or maybe not in quite the way they're describing it, but you can discover a way that'll be much closer than the solution they have now. And then the last question you always want to ask in these interviews is, so this has been really helpful. Can you introduce me to 1, 2, 3 more people who might also have this problem? And this is how you get past that first set of talking to friends and family and your colleagues and people who know you personally, so that you get to people who are a couple degrees away who are actually going to be honest with you and say, yeah, your idea kind of sucks, no one has that problem. Because that's really valuable feedback, and your friends will tell you that. After the problem exploration, after we've fully understood and we can now predict what kind of response we're going to get from customers or constituents, when we ask them about their problem, we know what their answer is going to be because we understand the language they're using to talk about it. Then we move on to a product pitch. The goal of the product pitch is to understand whether what you have to offer is valuable enough, the solution that you are envisioning is valuable enough that people are willing to give you some form of currency for it. Currency isn't always cash, although cash is great, particularly in a for-profit company. Currency can also mean they're willing to give you time, they're willing to take the time to hang up that bed mat, right? Or they're willing to travel to come pick it up from a central distribution point. Currency comes in all kinds of forms, but if you can't get people to give you currency for the solution that you're proposing, then that solution doesn't really speak to them, right? The solution isn't quite solving their problem in a way that they are excited about. And the way that we typically go through this is sort of another three-step approach. It's I have talked to people like you who tell me they have this problem. Do you also have this problem? Does that sound about right? Hopefully they say yes, because you've done the first part correct. The second one is you say, here's how people have told me that they're solving this problem now. Here are the ways that the solutions that they're working on that don't quite solve the problem and why we think that is. Does that sound about right? Validate this also, and at this point they're probably getting excited. And then you say, here's the solution that we've got. It solves this problem in a different way, and it addresses these concerns that you guys have about, that your customers have or your constituents have about previous solutions or the current solutions that you're working on, things you hack together that are too costly. Is this solution something that you will pay for now or take time to come pick up from the central distribution point? Will you give me some form of currency for this solution? And if they say yes, if a certain number of them say yes, then you have discovered a potential solution to the problem that they're facing, and you have presented it in a way that actually resonates with them. So then we move on to the third type of MVP, which is the concierge MVP, or the Wizard of Oz, or the fake it till you make it. And this is all about determining whether you can actually deliver the value that you are promising. So before we build a whole factory or write a whole bunch of software to deliver this solution, we're going to try to do it by hand, manually doing all the processes, doing things by hand. We're going to put the product on the back of our bike and take it out to the customer. We're going to, if it's a web application, we're going to put up a survey form and have people enter information, and then we get that survey information in email. We're going to manually process it and email them back the results. Right? This is a totally hacked together way of doing it that brings your upfront costs way down, and it's not scalable. It's going to cost you a lot to do this on an individual basis, but once you've done this process for 10, 20, 25, 50, 100 people, every step along the way, you can very easily tweak the process because you're doing it by hand. You're not committed to guessing up front what the best way is going to be to deliver this. And if you've done well, you also then have a proof that the value that you have promised to these people is something that you can actually deliver, and now you just have to automate the process. The danger here is the idea of paving the cow paths. Is if we automate the process before we know how it works, we end up with roads like Boston. Yeah, anybody from Boston? So we know that we've finished with this process when we achieve product market fit, which is another sort of buzzword that gets thrown around a lot. Basically what it means, there's a couple of different ways to measure it, but basically what it means is the solution that we've come up with is something that is fitting the needs of the people that we are offering it to, and it's something that they can take and understand and realize the value that we promised them. So there are a couple ways to measure this. The least sophisticated is to ask people if they like your product. The problem is that most of them are probably just going to tell you yes, because they don't want to hurt your feelings. They want to, people are notoriously bad at self-reporting their likes and dislikes. So there's a couple of tricks to get around this, some sort of psychology hacks that we like to use. One is the idea of Net Promoter Score, or NPS. And this is, we ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely would you be to recommend this solution to your friends? And we're not actually asking them to recommend the solution, but getting them to think about whether they would recommend the solution makes people think about, well, okay, am I going to stake my own reputation, my credibility on recommending this to other people? And then you're going to get a much more honest response about how much they like it and how much it's solving their problem. And so then we take the 0 to 10. We take anything below so a 9 and 10 give yourself 1 point. A 7 and 8 is 0, and anything below a 7 is minus 1 point. And if you've got positive Net Promoter Score, you're doing well, and that means you're probably pretty close to product market fit. There's other more sophisticated ways to do this. There's batteries of responses. You can ask people if our solution were to go away, to leave the marketplace, how disappointed would you be? And if people are saying we'd be really disappointed that we can't use that, you probably also have product market fit. Any questions? I know that was a lot, like rapid fire, so feel free to ask anything. Good? Okay. Yeah.
Can you relate that to kind of like a social entrepreneur setting?
Sure. So, there's a couple different pieces of it. One is to convince people that you are actually, or to convince your constituents that you're delivering value, and the other is to convince your funders. This goes back to the whole nonprofits are harder bit, right? You don't just have to figure out whether your customers like it, you also have to figure out whether funders like it and like the results that you're getting. So the process for a social venture or for a nonprofit is often, for starters, you have to figure out some way to measure what outcome you're looking for, right? If we want to increase education, we need some actual metrics that we can look at to say, here's how we know that we're actually succeeding in our goal, right? Because improving education is kind of amorphous, right? That sounds good in theory, but it's very hard to disprove that you're actually improving education. That's, with all of the hypotheses that we're forming here, it's really important that they be disprovable hypotheses, right? If you're forming a hypothesis and it's, it's something like we're making education better, but there's no way to actually prove to yourself you're not, then any amount of testing is going to get you useful data. So measuring both the product market fit metrics with your constituents, the constituents saying, yes, we like this service that you're providing, we like this, we like it enough to give you some form of currency, probably in the form of our time. We like the solution, we like the outcomes well enough that we're going to keep coming back and we're going to recommend it to our friends. And then measuring the metrics as well so that you know, all right, let's say we're increasing test scores, which I know anybody looking into education, you're probably cringing right now because using test scores as a proxy for improving education is totally flawed, but bear with me. If you actually have some data then to measure test scores, you can do either a randomized controlled trial where you have one set receiving the services you're providing and the other set not, or you can take the previous and the afterwards scores and compare them. It's not perfectly scientific. None of this is going to be statistically significant enough to get published in a peer-reviewed journal, but it is enough, in some cases, combined with a good story, to tell your funders and the foundations or the individual donors who are funding your nonprofit or social venture, here are the results that we're having, and we want to now scale these results to a wider audience, and we need more investment to do that. Does that answer the question? Cool. Anything else before we move forward? Yeah.
On the same thread, it seems especially hard for someone who's interested with an environmental mission, and then I don't know if that's anything you thought of or have any response.
Yeah, so that's a really good question and a great point. Most of my experience is in social programs, so I can't speak directly to the environmental stuff, but there are metrics that you can find in environmental improvement. I mean, you're still serving a particular constituency, right? Maybe an entire community instead of individuals, and measuring that is a little bit more difficult because you're trying to get a sort of an average of across the community, how are people feeling about the value that you're providing them. And then the metrics may be things relating to air quality, or you can probably throw some out better than I can. Anything off the top of your head?
It seems hard.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, percentage of people that recycle, or amount of overall refuse that is recycled versus put into landfills, and you can change that ratio. That's a great metric to measure. So that's a couple of examples, but yeah, you're right, it is difficult. But it is important to spend the time up front to try and figure out how you're going to measure success so that you know when you're having an impact and how much of an impact, and then you can then run tests to see, well, okay, if we're trying to increase the percentage of people who are recycling, we tried, putting flyers up and that changed it by X amount, and then we tried going door to door and talking to people and that raised it by X amount, so we know we're going to invest all of our time in the one that's more successful until it ceases to be more successful. And then we'll look for other ways to scale. Great question. Other questions? Yeah.
I realized that most of a large portion of the talk emphasizes on like there being a problem and trying to solve it right, through social enterprises, but there may be some social enterprises which focuses more on improving things instead of focusing on the problems. So how does this fit into that?
In some ways, you can look at that as two sides of the same coin, right? The problem may be that things are not as good as they could be, right? Things might be okay. Do you have a specific thing in mind, a specific example?
For example, like alleviating like discriminatory practices or something.
Sorry?
Like alleviating discriminatory practices.
Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, so, I mean, I think that is kind of a problem. And you might find people agree that there is a problem still there, despite, it may be more insidious than overt now, as opposed to the past. But yes, discrimination is a great example. There's a lot of things that, it depends on how you frame it, right? You still are going to need to find early adopters, the people who you're going to engage with when you're a new organization and just sort of figuring out how to have an impact, who think that it's a problem. Because if you can't find anybody who thinks that it's a problem, then trying to reach everybody at once is going to be really difficult. But if you can find a few people who think it is a problem and engage with them first, then once you've sort of figured it out and run your tests and scaled up, then you have an opportunity to engage all of the people who sort of don't really think it's a problem, but there's this great organization doing stuff, and they might actually be interested then in talking to you and hearing about the success that you've had. Does that make sense?
But what about if the social enterprise is trying to promote, say, a certain sort of culture?
Okay.
Yeah. So how does that fit into that?
Can you give me an example?
Like for instance, I have few friends and I were thinking about trying to promote like Japanese culture. Yeah, like through social enterprise, for instance. So it's not really a problem by itself, but it's more of promoting something. So how does that fit?
Yeah, so it sort of goes back to the idea of the electric scooters versus the Vespas. The problem, if you look at it on the surface, might be transportation, but what Trevor realized is that wasn't actually the problem. And so the problem may be something that is higher up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's not about shelter, food, or water. It's more somewhere closer to self-actualization. It's helping people realize their full selves and be satisfied with the life that they're living. And that's an equally valid problem to be tackling. And so it may just help to shift the context a little bit from the idea of problems as being concrete things to problems as being, helping people be their best selves. Yeah, sure. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first is, do you think like this lean startup methodology is more conducive to disruptive innovation? I know that's like a big thing in the management literature. And the second one is, okay, I forgot the second one.
Okay, well, I'll answer the first one.
Yeah.
So I think it works for both. I think there's definitely, it is very helpful in the approach of disruptive innovation because
What is disruptive?
Oh, sure. Yeah, do you want to give a definition?
It's like an innovation that completely like reshapes the market. This is a product that was never offered before. So it's like something totally new.
So as opposed to incremental innovation, which is the slowly improving the existing products, disruptive innovation would be, the internet comes along and suddenly nobody cares how good CDs sound, as an example. Lean Startup is great for disruptive innovation because it lets you test things that are disruptive innovation tend to be more risky because you don't have an understanding of how the market's going to react. It's not like we've got this CD and now we've got this high def CD and people are going to like that more.
Yeah.
It's we've got this thing that is another way of solving the problem of I want to listen to music, but we don't know how people are going to react to that. And so instead of investing a whole lot in that up front, we can run some tests. We can talk to people about how they see the problem, and then we can fake the delivery of the solution so that we can see whether it's something that they'll actually be interested in. Because often disruptive innovations are very, not always, but often they're very tech intensive. There's a lot of development that needs to go into providing a solution. Yeah? Yes?
Can you illustrate your principles with an example?
Sure. Which principles in particular?
Your basic principles.
So for the three types of
market
MVPs?
research.
Right, so for problem exploration and product pitch and concierge.
Yeah.
So Yeah, there's a organization that I've been mentoring that is trying to solve the problem of helping people who are applying to college who are athletes find a program that's a good fit for them athletically. Right? And it's a brother and sister team. They're both D1 athletes, and they're now trying to solve this problem because they saw that there was not a lot of good information, and they're trying to understand whether this is a broader problem. So the first step was they went and talked to a bunch of high school athletes about the challenges of finding an athletic program in a college that fit both them, their academics and their athletic skill, and that was a good fit for them overall, and finding all of that information and comparing their options to understand what the problem was and how the customers would talk about that problem, what language they used. Then she went back to these people after deciding what the solution was going to be and said, so here this is reiterating, we've heard that people have this problem of finding information about the coaches of various athletic programs and pulling that information together. We've heard it's very time consuming. We've heard that the way that people are solving that problem now is that they're going to a whole bunch of different websites, making lots of phone calls, and it gets them to where they're trying to go, but it takes a lot of effort. We have a new solution that pulls all of this together into a single database, and it's a website that you can search by sport or by location, size of school, and narrow down your results to a set of schools that fit your criteria with the athletics. And then she asked those people, is this something that would be valuable to you? Would you give me $30 right now as a down payment on having this service? And if enough of them say yes, then she goes on to the concierge stage, where instead of actually writing the software to build this whole database, what they'll do is they'll put up a survey on the website, so that potential users, these students, will go, they'll fill in what they're looking for, and then they'll click submit, and those survey results get emailed to this team, and they will take a look at those results. They will go and do the search process themselves, find the schools that fit that, and email back the results. And that's not sustainable, it's not scalable. They're eventually going to have to automate the process, but in the meantime, it helps them understand whether the data that they're giving back to those students is data that is answering the students' questions and solving their problem. And once they validate that, yes, in fact it is, then they can take the process that they've been doing manually and hire somebody to write the software to actually automate that process and scale up to working with thousands of students instead of tens of students. Good? Cool. Other questions? Yeah.
Have you found that the age of the entrepreneurs that are starting these businesses are older or young people? Are they professionals who have already worked in the industry and then they're using that industry-specific knowledge to start ventures?
Are you asking about startups that are following lean startups specifically?
Yeah. So from your experience, are they college graduates, or are they people who've been in the industry for a while?
It varies a lot. So Lean Startup Machine, which I mentor for and does intensive weekend workshops all over the world. We have attendees who are still in college, and we have attendees who have, they've got their college degree, they've got their PhD, they've been working in a research field for 15 years, and they're looking for a way to take some of that knowledge and apply it.
Okay.
And people who have been working in large corporations for a while and have seen problems, and they're now trying to figure out how they can solve those problems in other ways. So it varies a lot. I don't think that age is necessarily a screen.
It seems like a good kind of feedback mechanism within the lean startup is the internet survey. But what if you have a population of people who just they don't have the internet, or they don't have as much access?
You might actually be better off, because internet surveys seem like a great idea, but the problem with a survey is if I ask a question and I get a yes or no answer, or I ask a question and I get a multiple choice answer, I know what they answered, but I don't know why they answered that. And so particularly in the first stage of the problem exploration, we really want to go to the high bandwidth methods of communication where you're getting lots of information from people. You're sitting down with them, you're seeing their facial expressions, you're hearing their tone of voice, you're letting them ramble on and go in loops and talk about the peripheral problems that you might not have known to ask about. So actually, a lot of this can be done without any internet at all. So let's talk about a couple of the major objections that I normally hear. And we've touched on a couple of these, but these are when people are thinking about adopting lean startup processes in their organization, sometimes they'll say, well, you know, customers don't know what they want. You know, Steve Jobs just made the iPhone and gave it to people, and they didn't know that was what they wanted until they got it. So, setting aside the fact that Steve Jobs is an outlier, nobody should try to emulate that. It's true that customers and people in general are notoriously bad at self-reporting their own preferences, which is why we try to design experiments that observe people's behavior instead of just telling us what they're self-reporting. So we may, instead of asking people, would you pay for this, we might try to sell it to them and go through the entire process. And once they've handed us the money, we'll say, well, it's actually not available yet, but we'll let you know as soon as it is. Because that point, the difference between what people say they'll pay for and what they actually pay for is very different. So getting that real data about, oh, they actually thought that they were going to pay me money for this, even though they didn't know it wasn't ready, and then I'm not going to take their money, but getting them to that point gives me much more valid data than if I just ask, would you pay for this? It's kind of like if you have an event and you have people register, and they don't have to pay anything to register, about half of them don't show up, right? So that's one objection we hear. Here's another one is that if I'm doing problem interviews and I'm only talking to like 20 people, that's not statistically significant. That's totally true, it's not. But if you haven't talked to anybody, you have a very low degree of certainty, and talking to 20 people, it doesn't, when you have no certainty at all, it takes a very low amount to get you much more certainty than you had before. If you've already talked to 100 people, talking to 20 more is not going to change it very much. But we're not looking at trying to get, you know, statistically significant results to be published in peer-reviewed journals where we're talking about, we're actually doing the analysis of p-values and all that. We're talking about trying to reduce some of the risk of starting an organization. There's still going to be risk there. We're not going to eliminate it completely. But this is a way that we can get at least a little bit more certainty than we had before. Here's another one I hear a lot is when you're trying to solve a problem that you have, people often say, well, I'm my own customer, so I don't need to talk to other customers. That's fine, but that's a hobby, not a business, right? You may not be representative of a market. And so it's very important, if you're expecting that other people are going to use the solution you've come up with, that you actually validate that before you start building it. This is another one. Well, my friends all say it's a great idea. Everybody I talk to says this is great. We touched on this earlier. Your friends won't tell you what they actually think. They like you. They believe in you. They think you're a great person, so they think you're gonna make it work, even if it doesn't necessarily seem like a great idea. So talking to people beyond your initial circle is a very big step in actually getting some real validation. People will steal my idea. If I run a test and my idea is good, then someone else is going to come along and steal my idea, and I have to keep it secret until I launch it. Not true. One, just try to get somebody else to steal your idea. It's a lot harder than you think, right? Everybody's got their own ideas. They don't want yours. You're the only one who believes in your idea enough to think that somebody else wants to steal it. But then even if they do, even if you could get somebody to steal it, if all it takes for somebody else to come along and steal your idea is to see it in action, wouldn't you rather they steal your idea before you put months of time and thousands of dollars into building it? Probably. It'll save you a lot of heartbreak. Here's another one. People are worried that if I go through these tests and I say, well, you know, yes, buy it from me, and they go through the whole process and they get to the end and I say, well, actually, it's not ready. I was just sort of testing you. That people will be annoyed, or they'll be pissed off. They'll say, well, you suck. I'm not gonna buy from you when it's actually ready. So there's a couple of responses to this also. One of them is if you really have found a problem and you're the only person who's solving it in the way that they want, they're going to come back. But more importantly is you don't really care about getting those first 20 people you interview or 20 people you test with to be your customers, because if those are the only people that you can reach and get to be your customers, you don't have a business anyway. Right? They are representative of a larger sample of people who are going to be your early adopters. And once you've identified how to reach that particular type of person and how to repeatedly sell to them, those few people early on who didn't like your idea aren't going to be a problem. The other way to get around this is simply use a throwaway brand. Right? Instead of using the name of your real company, make up some company and run the test through that. Then they won't even know when you come back, and they'll be like, oh, this is a great idea. That other company totally sucked because they didn't give it to me, but these guys are great. And that's about where I end. I think I've noticed a couple people leaving. I think we're probably getting close to evening classes here, right? Maybe. So other questions? Anything that I can go into more detail on for you? Yeah.
I was thinking, just by way of sort of bringing into relief the model that you're setting up, what would be sort of some prominent counterexamples of what would go wrong, mistakes people make, and how they flop and why?
Fantastic question. He's not a plant, I swear. So the traditional waterfall model of product development starts with making a plan, and then you build things, and then you test them internally, and then you refine them, and then at the very end down here, you finally throw them over the wall to the customer and see what happens. We also like to sort of refer to this as big bang development, because you're going the whole way, and then at the end, everything explodes. Because you're not getting any feedback early in the process, it can be very costly to go through that whole process and then not have a success. And so, actually, I mentioned Steve Jobs. We can sort of look at two sort of examples there. One thing that's a common myth that I have to dispel first is that that they didn't test the iPhone with anybody before they released it. They did. They just kept it under wraps. All of the products that come out of Apple are very well tested. They're just not publicly tested, so you don't necessarily know that it's coming. Whereas if we go back a ways for Apple to a product called the Newton. Are you guys too young to know what the Newton was? No. Maybe. The Newton was kind of a precursor to the iPad. It was an old tablet device, probably the same era as Palm Pilots. Anybody know what those were? Okay, cool. And it was a complete flop, right? The development started off in-house, and they built this product, and they brought it to market, and for whatever reason, either people weren't ready for it, or the infrastructure wasn't there yet, or the idea of having this device was either too expensive, or it just didn't seem to provide enough value. The product utterly failed, and they pulled it off the market in, I don't know, a matter of, I guess, probably years, but it seemed like months. Then contrast that to the release of the iPad, preceded by the release of iPod Touch and these other devices. You can see it's sort of a steady progression. If you look at all the products Apple has released over the last 10 years, the last 15 years, you can see there's sort of a steady progression, and they get a little bit better each time, and they are mass testing them before they take each step. The iPad didn't come out of nowhere, right? It was basically a big iPod Touch. And so they already had a lot of data, and then they're refining the process and figuring out what people want. So that's maybe an example that some of you guys are familiar with and have seen the development of. Yeah.
What sort of thing would an investor be looking for in a startup, and how far along do most investors expect startups to be?
Great question. I'm not an investor, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But there are a lot of different kinds of investors. There's one specializing in seed stage rounds, which is very early before you've got a product really working. They're mostly investing in the team and maybe the idea. There's Series A after you've gotten some proof, some traction to say that yes, we've validated our problem, we've got a solution. We maybe even have tested it with some people and it seems to work. Give us millions of dollars so we can scale it. But there's a lot of people who are more qualified to give you advice on getting money from investors than I am. But in general, if you can show that you have a good team and traction, most of your work is already done. Right? If they believe in the people you have working on it, and you've already shown, you've validated, you've gone through some of these processes and shown you can actually that the problem is real, that the customers actually want the solution as you've described it, and that you can actually deliver the solution as you've described it, most of your work is done. There's a lot less risk for the investor, and they're much more likely to be receptive to your requests for funding. Yeah?
Would you show that empirically, or how would you kind of prove that you have gone through those steps? Through just hard data, or?
Hard data is great. Usually when you're pitching to investors, it's a mix of hard data and storytelling, because you do want to sort of this idea you want to catalyze fantasy. You want them to get how big this idea could be, and then they really don't want to miss out on it because it's going to be huge. The problem that the sort of stereotypical pitch is I've got my my business plan and I've got my projections and my revenue curve goes something like this, right? It's the hockey stick curve. And the problem with that most of the time is that the numbers that drive that projection are wild guesses. And so if you can prove that you've done some data, you've got some numbers, you know what the conversion rates are going to be, you know what your customer acquisition costs are going to be, then you can plug in some much closer numbers that they're still estimates, they're not perfect, but they're based on real data instead of, 5% sounds about right. And if you can show that, then there's a lot more credibility to your projections. Yeah. Yes.
We talked a little bit about what applications of lean management, of lean startup techniques there are, and you're obviously a big proponent, but are there any situations where you wouldn't recommend it?
There are no situations where I wouldn't recommend it at all, but I do tend to recommend that people take it not as gospel, but as a process. And if parts of the process aren't working for you, it's okay to change them, right? It's, in some ways, it bears a lot of similarity to the agile development movement, where the process itself you're improving your process on an iterative method also. So you may go out and do customer developments one way, perhaps the way that I told you to do them, and realize, you know what, that didn't work. Let's try this other thing instead. And so the key to achieving high velocity in an early growth company is to iterate not just on your product, but also on your process. And if you're going to be really disciplined about it, also iterating on yourself, right? The process of making yourself into a better entrepreneur is all about mitigating that ego risk, the third of the three types of risks that we talked about. Other questions? Yeah.
I think one of the most important aspects a student entrepreneur will be concerned about is the financial aspect. So, but how do we actually find out or actually find who are the investors who, because we don't really have a lot of network, right? So how do we actually find them in the first place?
Figure out which investors are likely to invest in your startup? Is that the question?
Or even trying to know them in the first place?
Trying to meet them?
Yes.
So networking is the answer, but not like networking like the sleazy thing that you guys probably all hate, but networking as in hanging out with people who have similar interests and talking about the things you're excited about. There's this concept called luck surface area. And the way you increase your luck surface area, one axis is do cool things, and the other axis is tell people about them, right? So if you do only one or the other, you're not going to get lucky. People aren't going to think, oh yeah, you should meet this person and then connect you. You have to do a mix of both, and you do great things and you tell people about them, and then people remember the things you're doing and introduce you to the other people who are interested in those same kind of things. And that may be co-founders, it may be investors, it may be first employees. It's a great approach to finding the right people to work with. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
All right. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I know that I'm taking time out of your Thursday night party time, so thank you for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it, and I hope you got something out of it.
That's not nice.